Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session where we will discuss EdTech's promise in delivering improved student learning. COVID has challenged us all in a lot of different ways, but for EdTech, it's propelled an especially unique set of circumstances. For years, EdTech supporters have been working hard to get consumer mindshare, but now EdTech has been given a bigger role to play almost overnight. Today, I'm really looking forward to hearing from a very interesting panel their reflections on what part of the EdTech promise were we able to deliver on over the last year and what needs to be done as we look ahead to the future. A warm welcome to all our panelists, each of whom is a disruptor in their own right and leading innovations that will shape what EdTech can do for India and hopefully globally. We have with us today Jairaj Bhattacharya, who is the founder and CEO of Convergenius, Mansi Kasliwal, who is the VP of Social Initiatives at Byju's, Nitin Kashyap, who is the Senior Product Manager at Read Along by Google, and Dr. Sahana Murthy, who is a professor at the EdTech department, the EdTech interdisciplinary program at IIT Bombay. I'm Rashi Dhanani, and I lead a portfolio of initiatives within the EdTech team at Central Square Foundation. Thank you for joining us today. So, Professor Sahana, perhaps you can kick us off and set some context of the EdTech landscape. Let's begin with reflections on what is EdTech's role emerging to be in the post-COVID world, and what are some of the critical issues in the EdTech ecosystem that are still thorny, and what are some of the innovative ideas that we now need in play to continue to drive impact on student learning outcomes.
Okay, thank you very much, Rashi. Thanks for setting this up. So, like you mentioned, in recent years, EdTech's seems to offer a very strong potential, and rightly so for certain reasons. It fulfills certain needs in the educational system and in the current scenario and so on. And as a result, the demand and supply of EdTech has surged, definitely post-COVID, but also in the last 10 years. There were these large-scale initiatives by the government of India, like the National Mission in Education through ICT. The traditional academic publishing houses reoriented towards technology division, producing content, and so on. Now, the variety of EdTech here is enormous. There exist different types of EdTech in terms of the intended goals, the target audience, the technologies used, the pedagogical design, cost, use case, and along lots of parameters. Now, what happens in this variety are a few key challenges for multiple stakeholders in the ecosystem, in the EdTech ecosystem. And due to these challenges, there's a lot of difficulty in making adoption decisions. In developing countries, one of the key problems here is that there are inadequate quality standards of what is good EdTech. Why should I use it? For what purpose? Will it actually make a difference? And it doesn't. The other thing that happens is there's a lack of any unbiased, reliable evaluations of the products out there. So as a result of this, especially in economic terms, there's a huge information asymmetry, and this leads to ad hoc, inefficient decision making without much regard to the impact on student learning outcomes. So this is sort of setting up the big challenge we have today. Rashid, do you want me to go on, or you want to?
Yeah, would also love to hear a little bit more about, what are some of the ideas that we continuously need to focus on to continue to drive impact on student learning outcomes as we look ahead, right?
Right. So the requirement here is actually a set of quality standards which are rigorous, which are the standards have to come for decades of existing research and existing practice. At the same time, they have to be usable by all stakeholders in the ecosystem. For example, government decision makers, schools, parents, individual users, as well as the product companies themselves. Because these standards can also serve as formative feedback for the product companies. So there's this huge need and this requirement for it. So along these lines, one of the initiatives that has in fact begun for the past year and a half as a partnership between IIT Bombay and Central Square Foundation is called EdTech Tulna. And this exactly is the idea. Come up with a set of key quality standards based on research, do unbiased, robust quality evaluations of the products in the market, publish them, and help all the decision makers use this to improve the overall quality. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Professor Sana. And Nitin, turning over to you, right? What are your thoughts on the need for increased evidence in the ecosystem over the last year or so? You know, what are a couple of things that have worked well since learning has shifted more online? And what are the things that didn't work so well? And do you see a role for evidence becoming a little bit more prominent as we go ahead?
Yeah, yeah. Thank you, Rashi, again, and I'm happy to be part of this discussion as well. So I think to answer your question is in two parts, right? And what has worked well and what has not worked well. I think my overall reflection is it's sort of you can think of it that we have survived a tsunami, right? But there is a lot of rebuilding to be done. I think what EdTech did, and more so also just the times that we were in with the penetration of mobile and all the other things. And when I say EdTech, I kind of mean including TV, radio, right? Use of education through any of those means, including even physical, right? The innovation that are happening, they probably helped reduce some of the damage, right? We didn't get a severity 10 cyclone or whatever, right? We got a severity 6, right? But we did no doubt have suffered a lot of damage, right? But given in this scenario, I think from reflecting on what worked well, the first thing that comes to my mind is just people's resilience, right? Including teachers, students, parents, administrators, everybody, right? Like overnight, when you have to come up with faced with something like this, you have to come up with solutions. How do you put things together, right? How do you board up your sort of windows when the storm is approaching? And a lot of people did that, right? I mean, especially in the first and second waves, teachers went to length to learn these new digital skills, create these videos, engage children, right? And many of them put themselves in the line of harm as well, but still continue doing their duty. I think that was the biggest thing, that observation for me. And the second thing which you hinted at, the increased mind share. So I believe it's no longer a question of if technology can help in people's mind, in policymakers' mind, in government's mind, in parents' mind, right? But it's the question shifted to how can technology really help, right? There are doubts and there are concerns that we have to address, right? But at least nobody's questioning, I don't see a value for it, I can continue doing what I was doing. Everybody's talking about how can we make it better and how can this help, right? And the third broad thing that worked well is I think it at least accelerated the pace of innovation in this area by 5 years or so, right? And that happened everywhere, right? Including teachers and learning digital themselves, policymakers thinking about what is the framework through which we think we can have EdTech. Like, I mean, you mentioned, Dr. Zahana, the Tulna initiative. I think the government came up like just recently with the whole national digital education architecture, which in my mind is a wonderful framework and document for exactly addressing many of these concerns, right? So even in those spheres, there was a lot of innovation around how solutions were put up, and I will not steal Jairaj's thunder on how they managed to use WhatsApp and everything so effectively to just reach so many people. But even from a Google point of view, the amount of investment that lots of companies are doing in now understanding these needs and meeting these needs better, suddenly that scale is completely different. Lots of startups have come up which they would have never done. They found some problem here and opportunity, and therefore they have created things. Many of them will succeed, some will not, but there will be immense learning in the system, right? So overall, those are, like, at the systemic level, those are things I think that worked really well, right? And the children we could reach because of this, therefore definitely did not suffer as much as they would have if these things would not have happened, right? But what did not work well, clearly the biggest thing that comes to mind is equity, right? We have still failed a lot of our children, right? There are a fair number of people who got access to it, children who had access at least to a device or to a TV, they could still get it. But there are a lot of children for whom, especially younger children, for whom education has been completely disrupted for a year and a half. And that learning loss is huge, right? So that I think has to be the number one focus overall for all of us to bridge first. And then comes the whole the focus on learning outcome. And that's where I think the evidence fits in, right? I don't blame the system. Like, over the last year and a half, our focus has been completely on one way, right? Because at least let's get the education content out there and let's reach out to them, right? And there have not been the frameworks, as Dr. Sana is pointing out, in terms of thinking about outcomes. I mean, if we are fairly honest, even in the non-digital world, the focus on outcomes was still a new thing that was coming in the education system, right? It's been a lot been on inputs, right? How to focus on outcomes and how to track them. There's a lot of academic research, but no real implementation sort of method. And I actually see a silver lining there, right? Maybe tracking outcomes with the help of digital and edtech could become easier, right, than it could be without it. Otherwise, for example, for a simple thing like if you want to track how are children reading in the offline world, if you do not use technology, right, you have to really find that much manpower to go and do these sample surveys and do all of that, right? But can technology open to doors to doing these things more innovatively, right? So absolutely with you that the role of evidence is quite strong, because that is what sort of solidifies people's engagement and makes it a long-term thing that we do. And I truly believe technology can really help in creating a bigger case for it.
Thank you, Nitin. Gerard, shifting gears to kind of Convergenius's journey, right? Nitin pointed out that equity has been an issue, and we all, of course, are aware of that, right? But what Convergenius has done over the last year, as you pivoted to your COVID response, can you tell us a little bit more about that and how you're thinking about solving the issues of scale and distribution, especially for Bharat, as you call it?
Thank you, Rashi. So yeah, Convergenius had a specific mission-aligned focus of providing EdTech for the bottom 100 million. So given that context, earlier our model for EdTech distribution was through schools and in-school programs where there were device ICT infrastructure. So we were essentially reliant on ICT and school time, and a certain period associated to providing EdTech dosage. But COVID happened and schools got shut, so we had to get back to the drawing board and think, how else can we distribute, and how else can we provide EdTech content to our beneficiary, which is the child at home, where access to devices from the parent is limited. So that kind of led us to think, how do we give one-click experiences to make it as easy as possible for EdTech consumption. And there were two things, two observations. One was essentially Google search is a one-click experience, and then there is WhatsApp. The internet for Bharat is WhatsApp, on which everything is happening. It's being shared, people are chatting in vernacular. So we essentially wanted to completely let go of all possible frictions, like downloading an app, getting through the OTP registration process. All that also required some kind of adoption friction, and it should be as simple as a click and you start learning. So that's what kind of pushed us to look at conversational AI and conversational experiences. And so we took our essential science of learning backstack, which we were delivering through our application, and we wrote a layer on WhatsApp, and we tried it out, and the hypothesis did work. And essentially, parents have access to WhatsApp, and they are okay to give their mobile device for a certain period of time to their children. And when the child likes it, it creates a habit. So essentially, it was a lot of iterations in terms of what would be the right amount of time and what kind of experience that will elicit a kind of a habit change, and also retention in terms of the completion rates being consistent over a period of time on a week-on-week basis. So that was kind of the key pivot that we had to kind of go through due to COVID, and that led us to overarching category creation process, where we were almost imagining that if we were to look at EdTech for Bharat as a homeschooling experience, and build on top of existing platforms like WhatsApp, Google, YouTube, and build experiences, build a adaptive learning layer on top of it. We are not reinventing the wheel, and we are also encouraging the ecosystem of content creators, teachers, etc., to build content, and we'll parameterize it. We'll link it to outcomes, and a digital distribution layer gets created in this process. And that could be a way for potentially the 197 odd smartphone devices across the 265 million students in India possibly in a sharing basis, to kind of create a process of EdTech equity. Rashi.
Thanks, Jairaj. Just a quick note to our audience. Please do give in your questions either in the chat or in the Q&A section on the right. We will be picking up the questions towards the second half of this conversation. Thanks, Jairaj. So, Mansi, would love to hear from you. What are some of the new product features or additions you see as of being of interest, right? As we focus on, especially for younger learners, with Nipun Bharat coming into play in a larger way, as the focus on improving student learning outcomes increases, right? And both from education and edtech, as that ask becomes larger.
Right. So I think it's very interesting to hear all of the points and perspectives that are coming from the other panelists. Now, in terms of what are some of the features that we are currently looking at, and especially for younger learners that you've asked, I think the one thing that we are really strongly looking at is a more phygital or experiential device experience for younger children to learn from, because I think we can all agree that a purely online one-way teaching system for younger kids, it's we cannot expect a very drastic learning outcomes to come out of that. And younger children, especially up to grade 4, need to experience education, need to be able to write, pick up a pen, paper, and experience education in a manner where they can actually use their hands. So that a phygital device, a device that the students can actually engage with, is something that we've been working on, and we do have a product right now out in the market that younger students can learn from, where they can actually write, and the device interacts with what the child has written on a piece of paper or on a tablet, and then gets reflected. So whether it is basic numeracy, whether it is literacy for younger kids, I think that is one way that has a lot of room for innovation, experiential online learning, even if it is happening in a remote manner. And if we look at older kids again, right, through our journey in the last 1.5 years, both when students from Bharat, as we are talking about, students from the base of the pyramid, or whether we are talking of students who have been able to afford fairly good quality digital education, I think the learning from both of those grounds has been one that vernacularization and contextualization of content are two critical elements in quick adoption and improving learning outcomes, right? So I think the one thing that we have done very quickly and continue to do is add languages, add layers of contextualization so that students can actually start engaging in content that's more and more relevant to them. So whether it's through instructional design, whether it's through improving languages, whether it is through introducing teachers also to come in and do part of that remote learning, I think those are some of the models that we are working on. In fact, the new thing that we've come up with recently is this idea of a dual teacher model, where one insight that we gained from the last year was that students are able to learn, they are able to stay engaged on a platform if the content quality is good. But while they're able to do that, the measurement of the outcome, or how multiple students are engaging on it, some of those elements are still being missed out because this is still a one-way stream of teaching. So even if we are doing synchronous classes, having two teachers in that synchronous mode makes complete sense, where one teacher is focused on the actual teaching and one teacher is focused on, let's say, doubt clearing, engagement of the student. Multiple options in that. If it's synchronous learning, then the dual teacher model is something that we're very strongly looking at. If it's asynchronous model, then how do we add more layers of data coming into our system so that we can actually start measuring learning outcomes at a deeper level. So because our product is a personally adaptive learning product where a lot of the inputs are anyway received, but during the pandemic, we've also gone offline. We've also created a module which is a completely offline model of our content, so that students who don't have internet access but have a device can also learn. Now, in the offline model, we've of course come up with sort of blended models of measuring the outcome, or getting data from ground on how the students are learning, what are the engagement times, what subjects are they learning better. So we've gained a lot of insights from many of those things. So I think going forward, at least from our perspective, the focus is definitely going to be on improving the learning efficacy in synchronous models, and coming up with more data parameters, coming up with better measuring techniques on the ground, whether it's an online model or whether it's online or offline content that's being delivered to the students.
Great, thank you, thank you, Mansi. Nitin, would love to hear from you. With the work that is being done with Read Along or maybe some of the other solutions, what can a blended learning model look like at scale for learning, right? Especially as you integrate closely with schools and governments, and you support more deeply. What do you really think the future of blended learning looks like using technology?
Yeah, I think, and that one's it's an interesting question in the sense of, one, I feel personally that I think the blended learning, what does it really mean, is also sort of up for, it's become like a buzzword now, everyone, right? So I think that the answer kind of depend and could vary based on that and how people interpret it, right? I think what is clear is, we will never be in the either extremes. We will never be in where we have gone completely back to the complete old world where everything is physical and there is very little digital adoption. And there is never going to be a world where everything is digital, right? And I'm speaking that being part of Google and sitting in a technology company where we want to help. But I think even within one of the core principles for our group, which focuses on learning and education within Google, is that technology alone will never be enough to solve for education, but it will be a core enabler, right? And so when I think about, and I would, if I may broaden the sort of question a little bit to, where do I think really EdTech can make a difference going forward, right? And naturally the answer will look like a blended learning world, right? But I think the key dimensions on which I think technology has to make a difference is access, first of all, right? It has to be anywhere, anytime. It has to be across any device. You should be able to continue your journey. If you happen to have a phone and that's all that you have, you should be able to still continue your education versus if you can afford a laptop, right? For most of it, we should be able to make sure that we can deliver similar experiences and similar impact on the children who are using it from an access device point of view, an internet point of view, right? There's a lot of role of EdTech companies and us to make sure that we can create those experiences. We don't create experiences which only work for a particular device or always rely that there have to be an internet connection and fine, kind of things like that, right? Then really the next four dimensions in my mind are all just how do you even break down this whole learning ecosystem in that sense. And the core actions for me are teaching, learning, assessing, and monitoring, right? And then each of these, the way I see things, technology has already started that sort of nudge, and it should broaden up. In teaching, teachers are much more digitally literate. Teachers want to create YouTube videos of their own or slides of their own or whatever that is, right? Which earlier they would not have done. They see the value that if they do it once, they can now use it again and again. They can share and collaborate with other teachers themselves, right? So a lot of those ways of working which were sort of embedded have changed, right? And then teachers getting and the tools that help teachers to create those materials better, for example, right? So a lot can be done in teaching. The other thing that in the future can also happen with technology is as the monitoring and assessing happens, technology tools can actually help teachers differentiate, identify groups of children who need a particular type of help and help on a particular learning outcome who are falling behind, and how could you help them, right? So a lot of scope for technology to help enhance teaching in that sense, right? Learning for individual children. Similarly, I think personalized learning is now is not a sort of novel concept, right? It's a concept that many companies have sort of got deep expertise in. They have mapped the learning outcomes. They have created the skill maps, and they can see how children are traversing it, right? It's not something as alien, right? And this can only help improve the experience for a child. How can you help the child in the moment when they are struggling with something? And then, but how can you also help remedy the basic skill underlying it? Like for my product, Read Along, our mission is universal literacy, and for helping children learn to read, even when they are offline, using voice, right? So which makes it two-way, because a child reads and they get real-time feedback, right? And it kind of takes away the need of somebody being present for you, right? So from a learning point of view, again, lots of scope for you can continue do your bulk of your learning and interaction and one-on-one and teacher-child interaction in the class, but then come back and practice anything at home and pick up from where you left, right? Assessing, I kind of already mentioned with again the learning outcomes and tracking comprehension. I think in the core element to build on what Dr. Sahana was saying earlier was the evaluation of tools is one, but the NDR framework, if I go back to it again, right, is a very comprehensive view of how do you take content and how do you really unbundle it and define attributes to it so that you can really create a common taxonomy of these are the learning outcomes level by level, grade by grade, subject by subject, right? And if there is a common terminology around that, then suddenly the ecosystem can contribute. Content creators can create it, search can find it, PAL companies can create experiences which give the right suggestion and help the child navigate the thing. So that for me is another basic foundational element of getting a common structure of learning outcomes and taxonomy created. Right. And then finally is monitoring, which, I mean, again, if you look, given the diversity that we have in India, the scale that we have in India, we know the reality on the ground, the amount of time the teachers spend in doing things that is administrative, right? And there again, there is a huge potential for technology to come in and take away a lot of mundane tasks, right? If you are taking a class line online, you should have your attendance already created. You don't have to then go and spend things. Or if you are grading things and assessment is happening, then the report card should already be prepared, and you don't have to spend time writing those things and transferring it and creating those reports. A lot of those tasks the burden should be taken away from those teachers, right? So I think the way I look at it, blended learning, the question for me is, as technology comes more and more into and works together with the people in the ecosystem, what all avenues can it open?
Very interesting. I'm also excited by the potential of Endure to kind of energize the ecosystem again, and look forward to all the innovation that will come from it. Another question for you, Nitin, from the audience. While I have you, I'll take this up. It's a question from Kinari. How challenging is it to design educational products for emerging users and for children across different age groups?
Yeah, great question, Kinari. And the short answer is very difficult. I'm sure Mansi and Jairaj would also agree there. I mean, I think, but that's that's also the challenge and thrill of it. But there's also a method in the madness, right? And that's where you rely on. I mean, I think the fundamental of really understanding what is the user problem, what comes in the way, then understanding your user in terms of how do they engage with with any solution that you are proposing, and continuously monitoring it and iterating it comes into the picture, right? And I mean, education is such a vast subject, and the answer changes from even for the same problem. Like, say, for example, learning to read. The needs of a grade 1 child are very different. They want more phonetic awareness and association with sounds versus a grade 2 or grade 3 child, right, where it is more about decoding and fluency. A grade 4 wants comprehension. A grade 5 now wants to do silent reading, right? And you have to kind of think about how will you meet the needs. And you can't meet the needs of all, also given it's always a resource constraint problem. We don't have infinite resources. So you have to start somewhere where the most of the meaty problem is, solve that, and then gradually build on it, right? Yeah.
Thanks.
I don't know, Mansi, Jairaj, if you want to add anything there.
No, I think you rightly pointed out that the needs at each stage are different, and therefore one size fits all solution is not really going to be a solution. So you pick the lowest hanging fruits with the maximum potential impact. You start with that, and then start building on layers, start building in personalization at every level, so that all students' needs are met in that sense. So yes, the short answer is it's not easy. A lot of resources are needed, a lot of in-depth, understanding, a lot of pedagogical research, instructional designers. There's a lot that needs to come together to really build learning products for children of all ages. But yeah, that's the exciting part, and that's the thrill. That those are the problems that we're trying to solve every day. So.
To complicate matters a little bit more here is that it, like Nitin and Mansi correctly pointed out, it's the needs in terms of what exactly the learners need to do at different levels are different, of course, but it's also how different students learn at different levels. There is Mansi kind of alluded to it. So again, there is a lot of research in the learning sciences and psychology and all. So there are some common ideas that help help the learner make sense of the material. Now, how a second grader makes sense and how a ninth grader makes sense may be different, and somehow that needs to be either built into the product or the teacher can do certain things. I think we'll come to that discussion in some time. At the same, or another example is we need to make sure that the children are intrinsically motivated and engaged. And by engaged, I don't mean the aesthetics or just the attractiveness, but are they cognitively engaged in the material? And how to do it at different levels of understanding, different grade levels are different. So this is definitely a tall order. I'm kind of sitting slightly on the other side than the three of you, but I am on the same side actually, helping with the design. So it's really hard. But there are these common principles, and the way they're operationalized might be different at the different.
Yeah, to add on to that, Sahana, I think we can take an analogy to the whole concept of science of telemedicine, right? The whole aspect of medicine earlier was a very complicated subject in general, in terms of how do we diagnose what is the problem and give a cure and give medicines. But there was a diagnosis science built over a period from 1920s to now. Similarly, learning is a science that is being unraveled, and I think the core to that is measurement of how essentially can we measure competencies, sub-competencies on the cognitive layer, and potentially a bit later on the non-cognitive layer as well. So I essentially, we have had this discussion earlier with Nitin that we are imagining learning also as a GPS map. If you were to able to find the child's current location, which is where they are today in a particular subject, and where they need to be, which is your grade level competency, you can create journeys, learning journeys, which are different for every child. And these are based on both the style of learning preferences as well as the learning pace in terms of how fast the child learns. So I think measurement is key. How do we essentially measure and diagnose?
And I'll just throw one in the works on that point, right? When we speak about measurement and when we speak about engagement, how close are we today to actually being able to tie this to student learning outcomes, right? Are we in the EdTech world able to kind of make that connection and then map and move children along that parameter? Or do we still have a fair amount of work to do to get there?
And I can go from a read-along point of view. I think the answer, I don't think we are close to whatever. Again, given the spectrum so much, right, the answer would be very different from for what competency you are talking about. Is it a science student in grade 10? I think the general framework is what Jairaj sort of articulated. Right? If you abstract it out completely, it's about creating the learning map, creating where you are, where you want to be, and how much distance can some intervention help you travel, right? But to make it more concretely, it's maybe it's a little bit more tangible and easy to understand when you're talking about learning to read, right? Because there, at least and again, I would focus down to grade 2, 3, 4, for example, right? And if you again either go to Nipun Bharat or even India, there at least, and there's a lot of academic research which is easy to understand, but also important and reasonably strong metric is oral reading fluency, right? At what speed is a child reading, and by grade what speed they should be able to read with comprehension, right? So that's something that can be very, very concretely defined and measured even with technology, right? And that, for one, is the metric that we use internally for read along, right? We have 3 million or 30 lakh children every month reading and spending 10-15 minutes day on day reading on the app, because the app is not just them watching videos or them watching videos where the color is changing of what text is being seen. They can do a lot of that kind of stuff as well to listen to the app, but they have to speak into the app, right? So the app can continuously listen to them, and therefore we have a very, very strong, simple signal of what is their reading speed and how does it increase once a child spends 100, 200, 300 minutes in the app, and we can actually see that, right? So that's an example of a well-defined learning metric that renders itself well to being measured and therefore can be used as an example, right? Not everything would be that simple, but I think that's the sort of general journey we would have to go through. Like, let's define the metric. It should be easy and predictive, right? And sort of credible. And once that is there, how do you make it measurable, right? and we will have to do it over and over again for all the different competencies involved.
Yeah, I think Nitin said this very well. That the key takeaway point here is the specificity, and the defining what exactly you're looking for. So, Rashi, to go back to your question, we making a connection between something as big and gross as engagement and technology, another bucket, and then student learning outcomes. These are all very big and complex, and it's not at all easy, and it's also not, I think, the right way to go about it, because there's a lot of nuance in each of these three buckets. And there's also a lot of myths and perceptions that, look, technology can come and solve all our educational problems today, which, I mean, none of the speakers have said that, of course. And what each of us is trying to do is to unpack these three or four different complex buckets. Now, in the last half an hour, we have talked about access issues. We've talked about engagement. We've talked about learning. We've talked about engagement is done. We've talked about a little bit about the efficiency. These are all different intended goals or purposes. So when some selection of edtech is being made, or by a school or by a parent, it has to be a little clear as to what exactly we are looking for in the product. Do I want a product to engage my children for a while, or do I want them to improve their oral skills? So this is on the selection side, but it's much more important on the design side, that do I want to create a product for the bottom 100 million users, like Gerard said, where a lot of the focus is on access and good content? Or do I want the 10th standard science student to be able to learn variable manipulations, where you have to maybe go with a little more involved simulations? And why this is important is, unfortunately, a single solution cannot address all of these equally well. I mean, this is not happy news. It may be even provocative, but we can't have a one-size-fits-all. So being very clear about why we are designing it and why we want to use a tech, I think that distinction is important to make when we start doing the measure.
And what, as we speak about kind of this measurement and thinking about designing products using data, what are some of the thoughts on, since I think all initiatives here would have gotten a lot more data over the last year than they have previously, right? How is this data being used to develop both products and programs in a more meaningful manner as we look ahead, right? Whether that's towards hyper-personalization, whether that's towards any of your other goals. What role is data playing today and will continue to play?
So maybe I can start with that, Rashi. So yes, in the last 1.5 year, we as a company have seen almost 200% growth in terms of users. There are 100 million users who have, in some ways, at some point in time, engaged with the Byju's content. And of course, the basic data that is being collected right now is what is the average time that is being spent by a child on the app. Which section is that time being spent on? Is it science? Is it mathematics? Is it a certain chapter in science? The assessments, quizzes that the children are taking on that. Are they taking a particular test repeatedly? Are they moving ahead? Are they skipping chapters? So all of that data is what is available for us to draw insights from. And currently, the way that we are using this data is, of course, number one, based on how students are engaging with different content, a constant improvement on how that content is delivered. If it's certain videos that are being skipped continuously by students, then of course a revision on how that particular piece of content is being delivered to the students. If students are not performing very well on a particular test, then are we delivering that test? So it's that the emphasis is on constantly improving how we are delivering the content, how we are testing the students, how we are making. So for us, I think like Dr. Sahana, pointed out, what is the objective here? Our primary objective has, of course, been, number one, getting students engaged so that learning continuity is maintained, especially during the pandemic, such that the students have content that they can learn from. Our focus has been on science and math, and therefore, science and math have always been subjects that are considered, difficult to learn, and students, rote learning involved and all of that. So the idea has been to take away that concept of rote learning and make learning fun, which is where the engaging content comes into play. So keeping, and then of course the basic objective, or I think the big mission, is to achieve learning outcomes by, number one, involving and engaging students more, number two, breaking down the content and concepts into very simple and easy to digest modules, so that children can very easily understand some of the more difficult concepts, and there's no rote learning involved. So now with all of those, the idea is that there should be learning outcomes, there should be improvement in how children are, number one, not being fearful of those subjects, and number two, because now they're not being fearful, they are able to learn better. So that is how a lot of the data that we are using is constantly being used to improve, number one, our own content, number two, also come up with new products. So one is the content side of things, and the other is, like I mentioned, from the synchronous classes that we were running, we realized that there is more to be done there, and perhaps having two teachers in a room would help in the learning, because now there's more than just delivering that content that the students need, and therefore there is improvement in what we are now delivering to the students. Even on the side where we are working with children in remote areas, many the data that has been collected is again being used to prioritize what we work on, because like everyone's pointing out to this, that it's a huge problem. There is just so many layers to work on. How do you prioritize which ones to pick, which are the battles to pick up right now and fight better? So I think how we are using the data is ensuring that we are coming up with better content, better products that are actually responding to students' needs, that are filling the gaps that that the students feel in their learning, the parents feel, the teachers feel in how they are able to teach. So a lot of the new features that are built are also addressing teachers, whether it is teacher training for digital education, whether it is providing teacher notes. In fact, that's been our effort with Google, with the Google Classroom suite that is now being bundled up with the Byju's content, because the idea there is that as we go into the blended model, how do you also address this problem for schools and not just students who have now been learning digitally? There has to be a marriage of both, where both of these primary stakeholders of the education system can come together and come on a common platform, so that learning can be made easier. And at the ground level, where children don't have complete access, digital access, the effort is to perhaps come up with insights, so that we can bring in new products, bring in bridge programs for grade level competency, for better literacy and numeracy. So yes, I think it's the way we are using data is primarily as a feedback to improve, to bring in constant improvement in whatever we are doing.
Gerald, do you want to add something from the way I think you also use from actual giving feedback to teachers as well, right? From your
Yeah. So Convegenius essentially believes in the whole model of nudge, right? We look at data as the input to the various nudges that we can potentially provide to the ecosystem. Now, when we look at the ecosystem, the primary stakeholders, as Mansi said, is the student and the teacher. In our segment, in the bottom 100 million, it is also the parent, because actually it's the parent's device on which the parent actually is being nudged to give the child access to the device. It's not really the child's device. So it's actually a choice architecture problem in terms of we have data, both engagement, outcomes data, attendance data. We have a lot more data actually. We are also correlating that data with other data points, like for a particular district, what are the teacher qualifications of that school where we are getting good responses in terms of outcomes, or what kind of infrastructure facilities of the UTIs is kind of provided in that school. And that big data trend allows us to also imagine how our learning outcome data points is correlated to the ecosystem, and how do we nudge the ecosystem in general, which are the secondary players in the ecosystem, which is like the BRCs, the CRCs, the government machinery. How do we design nudges for the other people who are important machineries in the ecosystem? So I think data is the key layer, and with the whole aspect of EdTech and the ability to generate data from the last mile, from the beneficiary, it's a huge value that we are creating, not just for the parent and the teacher, but also overall for an ecosystem level. And in the ecosystem, we also include our content partners. there's a lot of content players putting up content on YouTube for free, and they would want to know analytics about whether their content is working or not. For a given segment of say 1 million users, if we were to give two content players equal access, and one content player's content is working well, that data itself tells us a lot about why content A is working better than content B. So then there is a nudge given to the content player as well. You may want to tweak this part. So essentially, data is helping both nudges from a perspective of product, from a perspective of programs, and also behavioral nudges. We call it behavioral, right? I think Smita had brought it up, right? How do we behaviorally nudge the child or the parent to kind of just nudge them to maybe focus on fractions a bit more. So data is very critical for that, and the systems that we have today allow us to kind of find these patterns automatically. The AI and ML algorithms have evolved so much that we don't really need to rebuild those. They just give us insights based on the big data that we are generating, and we just have to build a layer on top of it to essentially nudge the stakeholders in the system.
Rashi, can I spend a couple of minutes on teachers, since the discussion of teachers has come up in this discussion, and I was also looking at the Q&A. There are several questions related to teachers.
Sure, Professor.
So, two key, when it comes to EdTech, the teachers have at least two functions. One is selection. How do I know which is the big one? There's so many in the market. Sometimes product companies come. Sometimes I just hear from everybody. So how do I select for my goal? And the second is, how do I use it more effectively? So when it comes to selection, rightly so, teachers really want to use something which is good, which is strong from a pedagogical perspective, which will help their students learn. And this point really has to be emphasized, because there are these perceptions that, oh, EdTech is fancy videos, EdTech is about fancy technology and all. It may involve those, but the core of the EdTech, what the course should do, is actually be strong in the pedagogical design and help the student be engaged and help the student learn. So along these lines, the Tulna initiative that I talked about in the beginning, we are having a launch of this initiative in a month or so, in a month and a half. So request all of you to do please join, see how the different products are performing, see what the large scale adopters are saying about it. So there is some guidance now being built for teachers and users and adopters on how to select based on what is important for them. When it comes to the use, there is a phrase in educational research called effective integration of EdTech. And integration means starting from the pedagogical purpose and using it more effectively. So, of course, it's not a one-way learning like Mansi mentioned earlier. The emphasis that one of the good things that the pandemic has done is because now technology is sort of there everywhere, teachers are asking, how do I use it? And what the teacher professional development groups are doing is bringing in the ideas of learner-centric approaches, active learning, giving the learner more control over what to be done, having teachers design activities around the technology. So this was there 50 years ago, it was there 100 years ago. But because of the technology, it's become easier now to, nudge teachers saying, design some active learning strategy in your class using the EdTech, because the student will learn better, the technology will also perform its function. So in some sense, we are taking the old strong ideas which didn't really, which weren't being used as much, and the lecture method and all was being used a lot more. But because now the technology is there and the teacher is not very sure of what to do, this strong ideas, the research-based ideas of active learning and learner-centric approaches are being reused using the technology. And I think that's one of the good things that the EdTech has done for.
To add to that, San, I just wanted to bring up one point though. While Tulana is benchmarking, there is also initiatives in terms of collaborating with regard to data that is also happening. Like, for example, Bharat EdTech initiative is just launched, where Vedantu, Topper, Mindspark and Convergenius are working together to kind of build together an interoperable architecture where their EdTech data, our EdTech data, we kind of create something together, right? I think there is enough data now post the pandemic where we can build that, where we have a common language and a common framework. So
you should align that to India, Jiraj. I mean, because I wanted to bring in that point. It sounds like I'm sort of supporting India at all, but if you look at it, I mean, the open data pillar is a critical pillar, open data and analytics of it, right? And so I think we are all sort of vehemently agreeing and landing on the same thing, that these are some common building blocks, right? Getting standards, getting reference implementations, getting evaluation methodologies, getting learning outcomes clearly defined, having data that can be shared. So I think the data, I mean, Google is a company based off data, right? So in that sense, but the two things I would just want to add, I think what both of you said, data is definitely used for improving the product, improving the user experiences. There is a huge potential for data in this space to help improve just design the system better. And somebody again on the Q&A said, look, India's education system has evolved since last 75 years. I would say even before, right? We are still in the pre-industrial era education system that we were given with. And yes, we are not in an illusion that EdTech will suddenly make things better in a year or two, right? I think this in my mind is a 10 to 15 year journey at least minimum, right? But I'm also hopeful. Like, I mean, it's like, imagine what the iPhone was when it came back in 2008, right? And if you were given that phone right now, you'd say, "What? This is what Apple made," right? And given what it is right now, so we are at that stage, or even pre that stage in EdTech, right? But there is clearly a great sort of blueprint in front of us, right? And it is for us to lose the opportunity to not act on it.
No, thanks, Nitin. I think those are some very interesting reflections as we kind of come to a close to the session, right? Maybe I'll just share one of the questions that was shared by Abhishek Nair just as closing comments as opposed to a question at the stage. But, he's just saying that different EdTech solutions are targeting and developing insights for different aspects of student learning, right? And it will be very interesting to see how the EdTech ecosystem collaborates internally and externally to create holistic solutions for the student and the teacher, right? And I think on that note, thank you all so much for this wonderful conversation and for joining from the audience. Thank you to Charcha, Nudge and Central Square Foundation for setting up today's event. Quickly, please stay on as a plug for the next session. The next session is on making EdTech accessible at scale and how to bridge the digital divide. Please do join and hear from an interesting set of panelists from Dalberg, Pratham, Kite, Samagra, and Central Square Foundation. Thank you again, all of you, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.